Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. Today, I'm joined in conversation by actress turned author Deborah Goodrich Royce. Deborah's second novel of psychological suspense, Ruby Falls, is just out from Post Hill Press and draws on a breadth of real life experiences, including a childhood visit to Ruby Falls, Tennessee, a love of words, and her background in television and film. Deborah is a Lake Erie College graduate. She earned a BA in Modern Languages, French and Italian, and minored in dance, and later received an honorary doctorate of humane letters from the institution. Perhaps best known for her role as Silver Kane, sister to Susan Lucci's iconic Erica Kane on All My Children, Deborah went on to star in feature films and television movies, and also appeared on popular shows such as St. Elsewhere, 21 Jump Street, and Beverly Hills 90210. Following the birth of her daughters, Deborah moved to Paris, where she worked as a reader at Les Studios Canal Plus. Upon her return to America, she was a story editor at Miramax Films and worked with a writing partner to develop screenplays, all ventures that would influence her transition to novelist. Deborah made her fiction debut with 2019's critically acclaimed Finding Mrs. Ford, which was singled out by Forbes.com, Good Morning America, and Book Riot. Her newest, Ruby Falls, about a newly married actress whose troubled present is haunted by a tragic past, was named one of the most riveting books of spring 2021 by Veranda magazine. Kirkus gave the book a rave review, noting, "Royce's prose is taut and propulsive. Ruby Falls inhabits a hallucinatory Hollywood where fact and fiction mingle freely, and even the smallest acts can feel ominous. An enjoyable pastiche with plenty of twists and turns." Now, Deborah Goodrich Royce reveals the ways in which life and art coalesce through storytelling. Hi, everybody. Today I am excited to be in the company of Deborah Goodrich Royce, critically acclaimed author. Her new book, her second psychological thriller, Ruby Falls, is out now. So welcome to the show, Deborah. It's nice to have you here.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you. So, I feel like I usually start with a more inspired question than this, but I want to start with the title of your book because some people will know that it's a song. But in addition to that, when we're thinking about the story that you tell, it applies to a character because it's a name. It applies to a place, which is a real place, but also very significant to this story. And then in its own way, it can also sort of apply to a state of being. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how the title serves as a jumping off point for this book.
Well, you really hit it. It is a double entendre that it begins in a cave near Chattanooga, Tennessee, called Ruby Falls, and it is an underground lake and waterfall that, to me, is one of the scariest places I've ever been. My parents took me there, and it really frightened me. So it begins there with a crisis that catapults the book. It is also the name of the main character, and she is falling quite a bit. So it's a play on words, and the book plays a lot with words. So we can talk more about that. Words are very important to me. So I had fun with the title.
Terrific. And we will come back to words because I love that there's a love of language, that runs throughout this book. But so we talked a little bit about Ruby and her fall after she has this sort of traumatic incident happen. And really what that is, and this isn't a spoiler, but when she's, I think, 6.5 years old, her dad does take her to Ruby Falls, and they are, underground in this cave. It's dark, it's dank. And he basically, disappears. And after that point in time, she rejects that name. She won't let anybody call her Ruby anymore. She becomes Eleanor or Ellie, which is her given name. But I wanted to know if you can tell me what it's like to really believably develop a character who's gone through such a lifelong trauma and has sort of a PTSD, and how her past haunts her presence now, and how you sort of capture that in an authentic way.
That's a really good question because we would call it PTSD now. When something so shocking and terrible happens to a person, how do they cope? Can they or can they not go on? I think we're much better equipped now to get help for people to whom something like that happens. I set the trauma in 1968 for a lot of reasons. She is abandoned in this cave, and the reason for the timing, a lot of it had to do with technology. I did not want the technology that would have made it much easier to figure out what happened. You know, if you write a book in a contemporary setting, you really do have to deal with our technological capacity. So the trauma happens then. And for a long while, I think she thinks, certainly her mother thinks she's coped with it maybe better than she has. And I think, you know, there's a thin crust of ice that she's skating on, and then a trigger happens later, and it kind of reawakens the whole thing. So how do you write that realistically? I don't know. I mean, I have my share of neuroses and anxieties. Everything you have that's inside of you is what you work with as a writer. And I think, having been an actor, you know, back in the day, you have to play all kinds of people, and you haven't necessarily done all kinds of things. Most of us have not murdered somebody, for example. But if we have to write or play a murderer, where do you go with that? Well, where you go is the range of feelings that inspires it. Let's say it's a fit of jealousy in that case. So we've all felt jealousy, if we're honest with ourselves. So you get into the emotional life that leads to the action as either a writer or actor.
Absolutely. And I may actually come back to that a little bit later to pick your brain about acting and how that lends itself to writing. But to keep going with this narrative thrust, so, you know, you talked about how it sort of takes place a bit in the past, and then we rush forward a couple decades. I believe we opened then again in 1987 or thereabouts. And so, you know, Ellie's grown up, she's established herself as an actress, and she appears to, you know, have this whirlwind romance with a very charming, kind man who has a great name, Orlando Monte. You talk about the beauty of language. And so I'm wondering if you can share with us a bit about their dynamic and how it sort of changes as they begin their life together as man and wife.
So what I was playing with there were a lot of constructs that you find in Gothic novels. If you think about the old Gothic novels like Jane Eyre or The Woman in White or Rebecca, this book very much refers to Rebecca. You have, generally speaking, a young, vulnerable woman who comes into the presence of a man who is probably more powerful, and he may or may not be a kind-hearted figure. He's ambiguous. You just don't know. He's a brooding figure, a dark figure. So I was playing with that as a launch point, and this idea that she marries him without knowing him, very spontaneously after a few weeks. It is a very ill-considered choice. All of our mothers would say, don't do that. And she does it. And so, you know, from the get-go, it's a setup. And she says these things. I play with things that people say on soap operas. She says things like, I've never been so happy before in my life. And you can just hear the thundercloud and the lightning right above her head. So you know, words, I enjoy playing with that. I enjoy playing with things that have been done in the past. I think there are no new stories. I'm not the first person to say that. I didn't say it as well as some people have said it. But so, you know, what are the stories? You know, boy meets girl, you know, you have love, you have death, you have loss, you have the range of human experiences. So within it, it's fun to play. So also, in the structure of a marriage, it is one of those structures, those constructs, where you think you're supposed to know another person as well as you know yourself. But it's kind of spooky, isn't it? Because you don't really. You hear stories all the time where somebody pops up with a secret life or a past or, you know, another family or this or that or the other thing. And it's, I think we're all intrigued by that because we all think, boy, I'm glad that's not me.
It's true. I can tell you, my wife and I, you know, often joke about, you know, becoming an episode of Dateline, or we've really succeeded if we don't become an episode of Dateline. But it's true. You only know as much as the other person is willing to tell you, or if you Google them. Um, but so to expand on that, sort of in a non-spoilery way, I did want to ask you too. Given Ellie's emotional difficulties and Orlando's seeming change of personality, there's this constant question, and I'm going to borrow from Aretha Franklin. I think it's Aretha Franklin here, but you keep asking yourself, who's zooming who? And so I just wanted to ask you, how do you endeavor to maintain the potency of this question from beginning to end? And how much of the answer did you know versus what sort of developed organically as the story unfolded?
Okay. So with Orlando, he starts out too good to be true. And, bringing our mothers back into it, generally speaking, if someone's too good to be true, it's too good to be true. So I wanted to set that up and to try not to do it in a cartoonish way. The name Orlando is both a very gothic name, a romantic name, a soap opera-y name. It's a little too good to be true. I love that name, by the way. So who's zooming who? Who? I try to keep that tension of Ellie watching her husband, where he becomes cruel, unkind, dismissive. I mean, he doesn't beat her or anything, but he goes up to that edge of being verbally abusive. And just as she is startled by it, he pulls back and is nice again. So if anybody has ever been in a relationship with a mercurial person, and many people have been, it is a very familiar dance. You just don't know, did he just say that? And then when the person changes again, it's very destabilizing. And I think women, and probably men too, can go down the path with a manipulative other. It's a slippery slope. It's like the thin edge of the wedge. You don't see yourself falling into it. So I wanted to establish that in the relationship.
Sure, and I thought it was really well done. And then it begs the question too, even if this is happening, will anybody ever believe me? Because obviously here's a person who knows how to put on that face. And I think there's a lot of tension with that as well. And then I wanted to ask you, about setting, because this book, there's various travels to different parts of the world that sort of take place with backstory. Some of it's set in New York. They marry in Italy, but the abundance of the time is spent in the Hollywood Hills. So I'm wondering if you can talk about how, the appearance of Hollywood and all that sunlight and the glitz and the glamour sort of contrasts with Ellie's character and her state of being as this all unfolds, because I thought it was a really interesting juxtaposition.
So when I moved to Los Angeles in 1984, a very close girlfriend moved with me, Anna Martinez, and she is one of the people I dedicate the book to. I've dedicated the book to 4 people who were very close to me in that period, who died young, all 4 of them, not all at once, but of different things. So Anna and I, when we moved to LA, we found this very thin book, a little bit more than a pamphlet, called Haunted Hollywood. we spent our time, I had a Rabbit convertible. We spent our time driving around Hollywood, going to the house of, Ramon Navarro, or the place where Sal Mineo died, or the place where, I don't know, some theater downtown that was supposedly haunted, or where Houdini lived, and on and on and on. And there's something about sunny places. Is it Carl Hyacin who refers to Florida as a sunny place for shady people? Which is a great line. There's something about that contrast of the perfect surface and what lies underneath. So I think LA, Hollywood, is a land of illusions. People go there to recreate themselves, to make things up, to leave the past behind. Also in Rebecca, to which this book refers, Manderley was, I mean, the first line of the book was the last time I saw, I dreamt I was at Manderley again. I'm not saying it right. So Manderley, this house, was so iconic and loomed so large in that story, and it's almost a character. And I do think of A Sense of Place as a character in a book. I like to write real places. The house I use, that is their perfect little English cottage in the Hollywood Hills, was a real house. It's no longer there. I lived in that house. It was so charming. I exaggerated, I changed a little bit, but it's more or less the same. The street is a real street. And I love, so with my first book, Finding Mrs. Ford, the Chamber of Commerce in Watch Hill, Rhode Island, created a little walking tour of Watch Hill because so much of it is set there. So I just like this idea that people can pick up a book and say, oh, I've been there, or I want to go there. I'll never forget reading Shadow of the Wind by Ruiz is his name, set in Barcelona, where I've never been. And it just gave me this yen to go to Barcelona and see all those places.
Sure, and it is interesting. I've only been to Hollywood twice, really, really quickly visits both times, but you expect, what you see on TV, but, you take a step in the wrong direction and very suddenly it's a very, different place, which is really interesting. And I love that, when you feel that in a book and you're sort of ensnared in this place with the characters. And I do agree that setting can very much be a character within a story. But I did want to ask you too. So Ellie is a former soap opera actress who later finds work in film, which is a background that is not unlike your own. And specifically, she's known for playing the sister on a soap opera with someone very, very famous, a la Susan Lucci, which people will know that you yourself had that distinction in your own career. So I wanted to ask you about the book's, autobiographical elements. And is it ever a concern for you that people, readers, might take what you're writing as fiction and interpret that as your own truth or your own experiences when you're really just taking similarities and running with it?
That's a great question. So that would be true of my first book as well. So as I go along, and it would be true of my third book, which I've just finished, first draft of. Yeah, I mean, as a writer, you take chunks and pieces of yourself, your story, your life, the stories of people weaving together. A lot of this book has a wink. I love literary puzzles, so I'm winking at the reader straight through. The chapter names, I name many chapters after movies, after quotations. Those are things that if you don't know those movies or you don't know what those quotations are, it won't ruin your reading of the book. But if you enjoy that sort of thing, it gives you another little fun thing to Google. What is she talking about here? So yes, Ellie played the sister of an actress called Sylvia Long on a soap opera called The Finger of Fate. I love that title. So I was on All My Children and played the sister of Susan Lucci. So Sylvia Long is not really similar to Susan Lucci. There's a plot point that revolves around Sylvia Long that is not true. I just made it up. For example, I went to Ruby Falls with my parents as a child. It scared me very much, but my parents did not leave me there. So that's a good example. It's true, I went there. I remember that they turned off the lights to pitch black. I cannot imagine that they would do that nowadays and avoid a lawsuit. Maybe it wasn't pitch black, that's how I remember it, but that's how I wrote it. And so I took the little bit of my life and I had a flight of fancy with it.
Sure, and I love to read the acknowledgments of books. Sometimes it's my favorite part of a book, and I love that there's this wild backstory about your character's downfall after the sort of rivalry that she has with the Susan Lucci like character, and then you say how Susan Lucci heard about it or read it and laughed and loved it, and I think that that's terrific because otherwise so many people are going to think, oh my gosh, what was the tension on that set? What's the story there? But it's
right.
So moral of that story is read the acknowledgments because you find some gems. But anyway, talking about sort of the winks that you make to the reader, I did want to ask you, about that, because the book is really sort of an homage to Gothic films and books. Particularly, you mentioned Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, and funnily enough, Eleanor is filming a remake of that movie in this book. That is her acting role. There's some gaslight. There's the sort of the works and the sensibilities of Alfred Hitchcock. So I'm wondering if you can talk about a little bit more in depth how they served as inspiration for you, but also the ways that you wanted to bring sort of a fresh twist to something that will be very familiar to a lot of your readers.
Well, it's exactly that. There are no new stories. And if you're someone like me and you read books and you watch movies, it all goes into your head. It's in that mental computer. And, a lot of times I think in reference to real life, but I think in reference to imaginary stories as well. And it's just all in there. And West Side Story is a reimagining of Romeo and Juliet. There's so many, but they're distinct, but yet it's all, I love that fresh take on an old story. I think about Alfred Hitchcock, and then I think about a director like Brian De Palma. He was working with a lot of the same themes in a different way. I think anybody who's creating anything is referring to something else a little bit, but then you have your fresh take on it. I mean, Ruby Falls does go in strange directions, much stranger than Rebecca, for sure. So it's not a remake, but it's using it as a point of departure.
Sure. And I think that's a lot of fun, especially, in recent years, films and books have become very meta and self-referential. Like I know growing up, Scream, the big thing was, wow, here's a horror movie, a slasher flick that's actually, very smart and that's not afraid to look at itself and poke fun at itself and allow the audience in on the joke. So I think that people who like that kind of story are going to really, really love this. And I know that that's an element that I responded to in this book. But let me ask you, I said I was going to come back to your days as an actress. And it's funny, recently we had April Fool's Day. And so, of course, I pulled out my copy of April Fool's Day and I'm like, I know that face. You were in that film. And a lot of people, will probably remember you for that, because horror movie fans are like the most passionate, devoted fan base that you might ever find. But I just wanted to ask you about your background as an actress as it applies to an entry point into the characters that you create. And you did, touch upon that earlier, but do you find that you inhabit them in a similar way that you come to the roles that you've played on screen or film?
I do find that. And, going back to referential, Scream was a little bit referential to April Fool's Day, because I think April Fool's Day was the first tongue-in-cheek horror film in the modern era. Yes, I do. And I feel that with every character I write, I try to get in their head. So this is a huge conversation now. Cultural appropriation. How can a white person write a black person? How can a man write a woman? How can anybody write anything they're not? And it is an important conversation. And all I can think of for myself is, here I am, sort of a middle-aged white woman, and you really wouldn't want to read my books if they were just all populated by a bunch of middle-aged white women. You'd think, well, that's not that interesting. So how do you write another character? I mean, you just have to get into the humanity of that character. You just have to look at the range of emotions that we all have, every single one of us, and do the best you can. One of the things I don't do, so in my first novel, Finding Mrs. Ford, I have an Iraqi character. And I did a tremendous amount of research into this particular group of Iraqis, Chaldeans, and then I just tried to write a real man, such as I understand them, but I didn't make him my main character. I don't know if I could have been so bold to do that. So, I mean, that's a long answer. You just, we all have this fan deck of emotions, and that's what we're operating on every day, and I think everybody is.
Sure. And so let me ask you too, moving into, actually, no, one more thing, the cover of the book, which people can see most of behind you. Usually I was telling you before that I like to hold it up, but I read this on
Got it.
there it is. That's right. It's a stunning cover, and there's a really interesting story, about the artwork that's used and what the inspiration came from. So would you mind sharing that briefly?
So there's an artist called Melanie Wilhide. She's a photographer, and she was doing a show in Los Angeles, and her computer was stolen. And it took about 3 weeks for the police to get it back. And when she tried to retrieve her photographs from the computer, the thief had tried to swipe it clean, and her photos came back like this, kind of all striated and sliced. And it inspired her to create a show around that mistake. So this photograph is called Grace and Thorns, and it was one of the photographs she created for that show, which she dedicated to her thief. The show was called To Adrian Rodriguez with Love. And this photo came to my attention through an artist and graphic designer I worked with on the first cover. And in so many ways, it so perfectly telegraphs, it's like a window into the book, because it's beautiful, but it's strange. There's something funny about it.
Yeah, I loved the story. I mean, it's so striking. And then, there's actually a note about it at the end of the book. So you're initially just struck by this, really gorgeous, interesting cover with sort of layers and textures and nuances to it. And then you realize that there's a deeper story there. And I loved that. But I guess to move into more general territory, I wanted to ask you, why you decided that you wanted to embark on a career as a novelist. And then I know that you had, previous careers where you were a reader, you were a story developer at Miramax Films, you've written screenplays. So can you talk also about how those experiences lent themselves to the transition to novelist?
Yeah, so I think I was on some sort of slow trajectory. I was on the roller coaster that took decades to go up, 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 up till it hit the point where it started to move. Uh, well, so as a writer, everything comes into it. I don't think as a younger person, I had the stories to tell that I have now. I also don't think as a younger person, I just had the breadth of imagination to create all these stories. I don't know why, because many younger people do. I just didn't. But all of it really came into it. So when I left acting, my first husband and I moved to France, where I was hired as a reader. And that was really kind of the cracking open of the door into the writing world. And it was such a terrific job to read other people's writing and to formulate my thoughts about it, which then segued into the job at Miramax, where I was working with some of the greatest writers in the world at the time in editing their words and their structure. And it was a little bit like graduate school for me in the 90s. And when I left Miramax, I was writing on my own, but it was all very secretive and closeted. And the juncture that happened for me at a certain point in 2014, my youngest child left the house, and I had a strong idea for a novel, and I decided to tell my friends I was writing a novel. And there was something about declaring myself. It's like the person who fiddles around with running. I'm not a runner, but the day they tell their friends, finally, I'm going to really try for the New York Marathon. When you do something like that, I think it's important to hold in your mind the possibility that you might not succeed and be okay with that. But there's something about declaring yourself that can be an impetus to push you forward in your commitment.
Sure, I think that's great advice. And, I like that it's sort of the antithesis to a lot of people will say before they're established, never tell anybody, that you're writing a book, because the only question you'll ever hear from them is, how's the book? Where's the book? When can I hold the book?
My husband was mortified that I told people I was writing a book, but I told him that I could really handle that question. And it for me and my personality, it was the right thing to do.
Sure. And I think that's terrific, knowing, that that's sort of going to be its own motivation and its own way to propel you forward. And so I wanted to ask you too, so you have landed sort of in psychological suspense territory, which is very, very popular. So I'm wondering, what draws you to the mystery? And is this a reflection of your own sort of pleasure reading? Is this what you like to read as well?
I read very broadly. I mostly read fiction, though. I do read occasional nonfiction, but I read broadly in fiction. I read a lot of literary fiction, a lot of thriller, some historical fiction. I do read biography. So I do love the genre. You live a while on this planet and you meet people who aren't necessarily who they say they are. And I just find that so interesting. When I was an actress, I did the TV movie with Mark Harmon about Ted Bundy. And I played this woman who married him. And I thought, well, what was she thinking? I mean, she had to have believed he didn't kill all those people. Otherwise, how could she have married him? And how interesting is that? I mean, he was known for presenting himself well. He was a classic sociopath. His presentational self was very charming. I knew a guy in LA who wasn't who he said he was. And it wasn't anything terribly malevolent that he was doing. But it turned out he was leading a fraudulent life. And you could have knocked me over with a feather when this thing was all exposed. I didn't know him that well, but it was just so odd and so perplexing as to why a person would do that. So I love that peeling of the onion that happens. I mean, think about Hitchcock. He did it so well. And those identity questions, think about a film like Vertigo. Who are people really? Even To Catch a Thief, who was John Roby? It's just, I love that.
Sure. And so I want to ask you about a sense of community as well, and sort of two prongs to this. One, in reading the acknowledgments, it seems that, you have a writer's group, you have a group of friends or associates that you're very comfortable, sharing your work with and getting feedback on. So I wanted to ask you, one, why that's important to have that group of people and how you know what feedback to take versus when you should just stick with your own initial gut instinct. But then too, the writing community, and I find, that people have this misperception that writers are in competition with one another and they're always trying to one up one another. But my experience, at least in sort of the mystery realm, is that it's a really supportive sort of cheerleader group where everybody wants everybody else to succeed. And there's a lot of camaraderie there. So can you talk about the two prongs to having those communities, the people who help you get through the initial writing, and then once the book is ready, the people who cheer you on and help you to get that book into the world?
Boy, that's so well said. So for my first two books, Finding Mrs. Ford and Ruby Falls, I used my friends as beta readers very heavily along the way. And it is very helpful if you trust your friends and the people I'm in a writing group with. They need to be honest people, but kind people. I don't think it is very helpful to have anybody rip you to shreds. I don't think that is a constructive technique. With the book I'm working on now, I've read, some chapters have been read in my writing group, so I've gotten some feedback there, but I haven't had anybody read the whole of it. So it's a little bit different for me because it's a strange book. It's a book that plays out in two parts. It's called Reef Road. And one part of it is a writer who's obsessed with the murder of her mother's best friend. My mother's best friend was murdered. And this writer is talking a lot about people who become obsessed with murders, like a Dominic Dunn, like a Michelle McNamara, these people who have had murders happen kind of next door to them, their own personal lives, and it becomes a fixation. And at the same time, I have the writer writing kind of a noirish thriller, and it all takes place in Palm Beach, Florida in the pandemic, the height of the pandemic last March, April, May, when the world was so crazy in lockdown, which is a plot point because the story of the woman But the writer is writing, the husband disappears on the last plane to Argentina with the 2 children, and she can't follow, she can't get on a plane. So that's a funny one because I haven't really had the beta readers on that. So I don't know if those two disparate elements coalesce.
Right.
If the reader is going to be able to like go off into the, the musings of the writer and go back to this plot-driven story. But that aside, I've relied heavily on that. And then you are so right about the community of writers. It has been one of the greatest joys of this writing journey. I was just reviewed for a book blog called Book Trib by a writer called Jody Millman. And we were both debut authors at Thriller Fest 2 years ago. And when I saw the review pop up, and it was a lovely review, and I saw it was Jody, I thought, this is just the nicest thing. I did a Q&A last night with Kimberly Bell. I've gotten nice blurbs from authors. I feel like there is this confederation of writers wishing each other well. And boy, it's a club I'm so proud to belong to now. I feel so grateful to be among them.
Yeah, it's a wonderful sense of community, even as a reader and reviewer and interviewer. It's like this big family where people are excited to see you. And even if even if for some reason you don't like their book, they don't care. As long as you give them a fair review, they're just happy, that you're reading it, which is kind of awesome. And thank you for, teasing your next book, because I was going to ask you about that at the end, but now I don't have to. But I will say that is the kind of book that I, gravitate towards. Anything with a writer character, being drawn into some mystery, some murder that's somehow personally related to them, like spot on. It's a great premise, so I'm looking forward to that. So just 2 more questions for you, if you don't mind. And the first one, and I'm just making an assumption that this might apply here, but your first book, Finding Mrs. Ford, came out 2 years ago. So this is your second book. You're, I assume, under contract now. I just wanted to ask you, did you find that there is a difference in the process of writing that first book? Because a lot of times, you can take all of the time that you want, any feedback, you can really work it until you feel like it's the book that it needs to be. And then when that sells and somebody is expecting another book, either, within a year or 2, you don't have as much time or freedom. So I just wanted you to sort of compare and contrast the writing process between that first book and this one.
The writing process between Finding Mrs. Ford and Ruby Falls was not that much different, because I had more or less finished a number of drafts of Ruby by the time I sold Finding Mrs. Ford. So there was an overlap of those two. Where I'm really seeing that is with the third book, Reef Road. I am, first of all, it was the pandemic, so I had a chance to hunker down, and I had a draft in 10 months. I'm not a fast writer, but yeah, I think one of the most important parts of writing is the time when you're not writing. That's when ideas can come to you. And if you don't give yourself that time, you might not solve all the problems in the book, because it isn't just sitting at the page where you're solving problems. It's when you're brushing your teeth, or you wake up in the middle of the night, or you're walking your dog, that suddenly you think, that's it. That's how that thing's going to work. I was going down the wrong path there. And I think that's how the human mind works. So time, I think, is important. I don't think I'll ever have a book a year, and many writers do it beautifully. My first 2 books were 2 years apart, but it doesn't reflect starting the second book after the first one was sold. So there was a much longer overlap. So the third book, I don't know if it will follow in 2 years. I want to make sure it's right and it works first. So I don't have a time deadline.
Sure, that's great. And so final question for you, and I like to ask this of pretty much anybody I speak to, because I know that there are people out there always looking for thoughtful suggestions, who might want to follow their own, pursuit of fiction, nonfiction, whatever it might be. So in terms of, a creative life or a writing life, because you've lived both, can you tell us what the best advice is that you think you've ever gotten? And then on the other hand of that, what is the best advice that you never got and had to learn for yourself and wish that maybe you could have told your younger self?
So the best advice I've gotten in any creative endeavor is just to practice, 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 keep doing it. Malcolm Gladwell, the 10,000 hours, it is in the doing that you get better at doing whatever it is you're doing. So that's the best advice I've ever gotten. The best advice I've never gotten is don't be afraid and don't hold yourself to somebody else's standard. The authors who have, that great book release at age 25, that is so fabulous. It's so wonderful. It's not everybody's story. If we could all just let go of that fear that if we haven't done a certain thing at a certain time, we'll never be able to do it. And that looking over your shoulder and comparing to somebody else, there's so much in the future. There's so much ahead. There are things that you will do that you are not even imagining right now. And to me, that's just such a great adventure.
I think that's a great point to leave this. The world is sort of wide open. The canvas is blank. Do with it what you will. So Deborah, this was a real pleasure for me. Thank you so much for sitting down and talking with me. And I want to remind readers that Ruby Falls is available right now. You should definitely pick it up. I can tell you from my own experience that you will not regret it. It's riveting. I read it in 2 days, and that was slowing myself down because I didn't want to, ruin it all at once. But it was really, really wonderful. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. So good to talk with you again.
That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.